9 a.m. here in Boston, or Cambridge, or wherever you are in the Eastern Daylight Time Zone. And it's, I believe, 9 p.m. for our speaker today, Sayaka Chatani. And it's good evening to those of you watching from Japan as well, or elsewhere in Asia. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sayaka Chatani to speak to us today. I've known her since she applied to graduate school some years ago, and she decided to do her graduate work at Columbia, to my sorrow, but to her great success, and has gone on to do really fantastic work in the history of Japan and Asia. Her work is a model of the potentials for international history or a global history that includes Japan and other places in East Asia. Her research interests are at the intersection of nation, military, and society in East Asia, working on ideology and emotions, on the Japanese colonial empire, with a particular focus on youth in her terrific first book, Nation Empire, Ideology and Role Youth in Japan and its Colonies, which came out in 2018 from Cornell Press and won the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award in 2019. She's been active since then, publishing work related to her ongoing studies. She's published in the American Historical Review, in Critical Asian Studies, in the Journal of Asian Studies, the Journal of Japanese Studies, and elsewhere. In the last just 2 years, she's published an article in the JAS, Revisiting Korean Slums in Post-War Japan, and more recently, Becoming Korean Japanese Wives in the Boundary Formation of a Leftist Zainichi Community in Critical Asian Studies. She also did very important work that I admire with Amy Stanley, Hannah Shepard, Chelsea Scheider, and David Ambaris, critiquing the work by my colleague here at Harvard, Mark Ramsire, on contracting for sex in the Pacific War. And you can find that in Asia Pacific Journal, Japan Focus. Sayaka Chatani is currently undertaking 2 book-length projects, Project Korea, Chongyeon in Post-Imperial Japan, and another on After Exodus, How Zainichi Reshaped North Korea. She is also the editor of a web project that I hope to use in my future teaching, Grassroots Operations of the Japanese Empire, Translated Primary Sources for Teaching Purposes. And I should say that today's talk will be related most closely to one of her ongoing book projects, the study Project Korea. Today's talk, I should say, is co-sponsored by the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies and the Korea Institute at Harvard, as well as the program on U.S.-Japan relations as our main host. And so, without further ado, I want to just briefly mention the upcoming seminar, a note on Zoom etiquette, and turn things over to Sayaka. So here you see next week's talk, very quickly. I hope you didn't blink. And Zoom etiquette, you're all, I think, familiar with this. During towards the end of the talk and during the Q&A session, you may write and ask a question in Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You could actually post that at any point. I should mention that and I will field and read out the questions. This session is being recorded by staff. We will only be recording the images of the audio and the speakers. You audience members will not be visible or audible. All right, and you see the privacy note there. So let's get going. Sayaka, over to you.
Okay, let me share the screen first. Okay, I hope you can see it now. All right, thank you very much, Professor Gordon, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Dr. Fujihira, for inviting me today. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Today's presentation is based on my current research on Zainichi history, and I have a mighty research partner, Kumi Cho. I think she's in the audience today. She herself is a third-generation Zainichi person, and with Kumi, I'm studying a social history of Chongyeon, or in Japanese, Chosen Soden, which is a pro-North Korean organization in the community, but we're particularly interested in social history. So we've done interviews with more than 250 people, which includes non-Cheonryong people, or Mindan cadres, and North Korean defectors, and many kinds of Zainichi people and Japanese activists as well. So I'm writing about Cheonryong community, but I also want to try to locate the community within larger Zainichi society, Japanese society, and international politics and Korean politics. So today's presentation is a snippet of how I view the big picture of Zainichi politics and Zainichi movements in Japan. But I'm happy to talk about my other parts of my research as well. Okay, so I want to emphasize that today's talk focuses on the very first 2 or 3 decades after 1945. So the Cheonryong of this period is very different, quite different from what you know about Cheonryong today, or Chosen Soden today. And you probably, if you are from Japan or you lived in Japan, you probably have an image of top-down control and closed society and unpopular and small Zainichi anachronistic society. But back then, at the beginning, it was hegemonic. Cheonryong had great cultural sphere, and 70 to 80% of Korean residents in Japan, so Zainichi residents in Japan, according to the Japanese source, supported the leftist Korean group. So I have 2 key questions regarding this period. So why did Cheonryong exercise hegemonic power? So that's the first question. And the second question is about Japanese supporters for Zainichi movements. So what did the post-war Korean question, or Korea question, mean to Japanese supporters? So for Japanese supporters, they didn't have loyalty to the Cheonryong organization per se, but they found a historical meaning in solving and dealing with the Korea question of issues about Zainichi people as well. So my short answer to these questions is in the title of this talk, which is Cheonryong represented a decolonization movement, and for Japanese supporters, Zainichi Koreans or Zainichi movements were about de-imperialization of Japanese society and Japanese people. So any discussion about Zainichi people start in colonial period, because the presence of Zainichi people is the product of colonial rule. So as most of you know, Japan colonized Korea, and that's why Koreans migrated to Japan. And I just listed some of the major reasons for their migration. Many of them lost access to land after the land survey, colonial land survey in the 1920s. Many of them met famines in the 1930s. They wanted to have access to higher education, which was very difficult in Korea. And for those people who lived in Japan around this period, have a vivid memory, and probably this is the most impactful experience for Korean residents. That was massacre of Korean residents after the Kanto earthquake, and that memory lingered for decades to come, and even today. In the late 1930s, Kominka education started, which is a forceful Japanization education. So that basically instilled Korean youth and children in Japanese schools how the Japanese superiority was, how the Japanese empire created Japanese consciousness and imperial ideology into Korean children. So they started to look down upon their own parents and grandparents who represented the backwardness, so-called backwardness of Korean ethnicity. And in the 1940s, there was a massive number of forced laborers taken to Japan, conscripted to Japan. And as you can see in this graph of registered Korean population in Japan, there's a sharp rise in the number of Koreans living in Japan in the 1940s. And thus, this indicated that the big scale of Korean labor forces taken to Japan. For the history of Zainichi society, though, this not necessarily the sharp rise, but the sharp decline really was an important factor that defined the mindset of Zainichi Koreans, especially for the first generations in the aftermath of World War II. So basically, this was the first exodus from Japan to the Korean Peninsula, and this set the mindset of going home sometime in the future in many of the first generations Koreans. Now, here in Singapore, I have many excellent colleagues who work on the history of Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, and we exchange notes and our opinions, and we listen to each other's talks very often, and which is really, really interesting, because I realized that Korean diaspora and Chinese diaspora definitely belong to the same period, the same international temporality. But at the same time, Korean diaspora in Japan faced very unique situations, and I listed some of them here. First of all, the host country, Japan, was occupied by a third party, Americans, and their homeland was divided, which was somewhat similar to Chinese situation. But in the Chinese situation, it was mainland China versus Taiwan, which is different from the Korean Peninsula, which was cut in half. So the Korean situation was similar to two Germanys around this time. The Zainichi Koreans, Korean residents in Japan, 98% of them came from the southern part of Korea. So their hometowns were all in South Korea, but these hometowns were also under the American occupation, which is also peculiar to Zainichi Koreans. And they had a clear, vivid memory of massacre after Kanto earthquake. So the fear was real. The fear of massacres after World War II was felt very real. For younger generations who went through the wartime Japanese education, their imperial mindset went upside down, and now they have to quickly and often painfully to regenerate ethnic pride in Korean ethnicity. And decisively, the Korean War perpetuated the hostility between the divided Koreas, which made two Koreas definitely different from two Germanys. And after all, these Korean people were stuck in the former colonizers' land. So whatever the practical reason that motivated them to remain in Japan, the idea of living in the former colonizers' land bothered many first and second generation Koreans as well. And just a few words about the American occupation. So American officers who came to Japan to occupy Japan had no idea who Koreans were, like what Korea was about and why Koreans were there. So they really had very little idea. But they did have ideological concerns, which is anti-communism. And they asked Japanese advisors and officers. So they inherited the Japanese views of Koreans as dangerous, backward people that they should be very careful of. So this combination of ignorance and security concerns led to this grave mistake of ordering to close Korean schools in 1948. So the Korean schools was the focal point for many Korean residents across the Japanese archipelago to regenerate Korean national identity. They taught Korean language, history, and national consciousness to children and young people through Korean schools. There were hundreds of them immediately after World War II, but the Americans thought they were dangerous. Japanese thought they were dangerous, so they closed down. And that obviously led to massive demonstrations across Japan, and famous ones were in Hyogo and Osaka. And the photo here at the bottom is a scene where Koreans burst into the Osaka prefectural office. The photo on the top is, I don't know if this should be called typical, but one of the many Korean slums that were built after war. This one is in Hakata in Fukuoka. The picture itself was taken in the early 1960s. Now, I just also want to briefly mention what, if you read major English language books on Zainichi studies, what you would know. So I just listed 3 major points. One is a new kind of oppression over Korean people, a neo-imperial attitude of the Japanese government in the US. There was legal limits in citizenship, and the government and society endorsed open discrimination. And secondly, we also know very well that there was 2 large mass organizations for Zainichi people. One is pro-North Korea, and the other is pro-South Korea. And there was political confrontation between the 2. Pro-North Korea organization started in the Korean League, which was built in October 1945, which was also ordered to be disbanded in 1949. And around the time of the Korean War, the same Korean leaders organized Minjeon, which was underground organization. And in 1955, officially, they established Chonryun. And at its inception, their leaders declared that they are North Korean residents, North Korean nationals residing abroad. So they would stop meddling with Japanese politics. So they retreated from the previous tactics of working together with Japanese Communist Party. And the most famous event or mobilization that the Chonryun did, that scholars usually know, is this repatriation movement to North Korea. Although most of them came from South Korea, 93,000 or more people moved to North Korea starting in December 1959. This was depicted in a famous book, Exodus to North Korea, written by Tesamori Suzuki. The other side, the pro-South Korean side, was called Mindan. It still is called Mindan, and which was also established in 1946, but it started small. It was a reactionary group. It didn't have the same kind of popular basis among Zainichi people. And it was only in the 1960s when South Korea and Japan signed a normalization treaty that made Mindan a significant, important organization among Zainichi people. And this was because the treaty allowed South Korean passport holders to obtain permanent residency in Japan. So many people took that opportunity to get South Korean passports. But by doing that, they were also forced to become Mindan members. So as just looking at membership, Mindan became pretty big in the 1960s. Another thing, the last thing that scholars always talk about is more recent generations, younger generations, later generations were not really concerned of the homeland politics. So many people use the word third way, which became a term in the 1970s, not Korean, not Japanese, but the third identity, which is Zainichi. And also sociologists tend to emphasize the fragmented, diverse identities and lifestyles of Zainichi people of this period. So that's the kind of picture that we tend to get. What I want to do is to add more layers to our understanding of Zainichi experiences. And I chose decolonization and deimperialization as themes to focus on today. Okay, here's my spiel. I have 3 major points today. The first one is this: we should look at Chonryun as a decolonization movement. And when I say Chonryun, it includes the preceding organizations like the Korean League and Minjeon. And I want to emphasize that this was a bottom-up movement. And I I wrote this article in the Journal of Asian Studies last year, revisiting Korean slums in post-war Japan. And in here, I basically argued that Korean slums and Korean schools became a sort of autonomous territory for Zainichi Koreans. And that basically gave identity of having established ethnic autonomy and an ethnic independence while they still lived in Japan. What's interesting about this phenomenon of creating their autonomous territory is that Cheonryun's grassroots experience belonged to more of an international trend of decolonization or third world movements and independence movements in the middle, although they were in the middle of the bastion of neo-imperialism of the United States. So that affected, you can imagine how their belonging was different from just an ethnic minority living in the corner of Japanese society. So the idea of ethnic autonomy made them further detached from Japanese surrounding society and belong directly to international dynamics. And I also want to remind everyone that North Korea at this stage was an inspiration to many international and Japanese activists. And what it represented was also anti-imperialism, anti-American imperialism. So it was not puzzling. So it was quite understandable that Cheonryun people really enthusiastically belonged to North Korea around this time. And I want to continue to the next slide. So this decolonization movement and their affiliation to North Korea led them to an interesting choice as an expression of completion of their decolonization, which is isolation from Japanese politics. And I personally believe that this detachment gravely affected post-war Japanese society, which just continued to become more and more conservative. Basically, Cheonryun people had a lot of underclass ethnic activists and ethnic minority activists, but they retreated from Japanese politics, and that probably enabled the Japanese politics and LDP to focus on conservative goals. Anyway, so Cheonryun people developed moral confidence, and that moral confidence created hegemony across Zainichi society, and this came from grassroots communities until the mid-1960s. But at the same time, I have to say that North Korea started to dominate Cheonryun organizations, policies, and operations gradually or rapidly, because North Korean doctrines helped Cheonryun members at the grassroots level. They mitigated diasporic problems. I think I need to explain what I mean by that. So for example, among Korean residents, there's a strong feeling that they have lost a state before, and which turned into a very oppressive colonial rule. So having your own government became the first and foremost goal, and that led to the appreciation of formidable, powerful leadership both in North Korea and Cheonryun. Another example is that many of the North Korean doctrines, like Juliet, had a lot of resonance. It resonated among Zainichi Koreans because it indicated, they validated ethnic autonomy that they created in slums. Also, Juche and personality cult was a mixture of traditional ideas and socialist ideas. So this mixture bridged the generational gap, which was typical in many diasporic societies. For example, there was a movement called Follow Mother Kampansok, And Kam Pan-seok was the mother of Kim Il-sung, and this is a sort of a subcategory of Kim Il-sung's personality cult. But this idea of making Kam Pan-seok, who was very devoted and very Confucian and very conservative mother who devoted to the revolutionary cause of her own son. But this stories, the language, official language about Kam Pan-seok was totally appreciated by younger women in Chonyeon society, because now they can understand, they have the language to appreciate their own mother's sufferings that they have been witnessing. So many of their mothers were illiterate, undereducated, and they were very Confucian, traditional, and stubborn. And usually outside of this Chonyeon circle, the Zainichi society saw a lot of generational conflicts, especially when it comes to women's issues. But in Chonyeon society, for good and bad, the North Korean doctrines bridged that generational gap. So they used North Korean doctrines to make sense of their lives and family relationships. This attitude eventually led to more radical control, which I call a cultural revolution, a version of cultural revolution that happened in the late 1960s and 1970s among Chonyeon people. They call it Kim Byung-sik era. But anyway, during this period, they had lots of mutual criticisms and self-criticism, and they really pushed the personality cult of Kim Il-sung. So in a nutshell, I would just want to say Chonyeon established its hegemony in Zainichi society as a major force for people's decolonization. The second point that I want to make is about Japanese supporters. Zainichi activism was a major goal and a mean of deimperialization for Japanese people. The standard narrative about Japanese deimperialization, or squarely facing the imperial guilt, was that it never happened. They forgot about imperial guilt under the American occupation. And if you see early scholarship by social scientists in Japan, Korea was not there. Scholars like Maruyama Masao focused on militarism and fascism, but not in imperialism. And scholar like Takeuchi Yoshimi, who is famous for bringing Asia back into the discourse, focused on China, not Korea. But there were a few scholars who worked really hard to bring in Korean studies in post-war Japan, and they were keenly aware of Japan's imperial sins. And I just put two book covers here. One is Kamoto Isao on the top, Chosengo Kangaeru. He was a person who compiled the first Korean-Japanese dictionary in post-war Japan. It was massive compilation, and this book is a memoir of his work. And he worked really hard. He sold his family asset. He fell seriously ill, but he continued doing it. And he finally published it in 1970s. So in his memoir, it's clear that he considered this as an emancipation of himself from Japan's imperial sins. And another book, which I put here at the bottom, Sato Kazumi, he also is very clear about his recognition of Japan's responsibility in Korean affairs, Korean dictatorship, and Korean Zainichi problems too. But interestingly, Sato Kazumi is now famous for anti-North Korean writer. So he had a major turn in the 1990s. There are a bunch of journalists who also were quite vocal about Korea problems as well. One of them was Yasue Ryosuke, who was a famous, legendary editor of Sekai, an intellectual magazine by Iwanami. But this mindset of seeing Zainichi Korean issues and Korea problem, or studying Korea, was not limited to intellectuals and published writers. There's so many incidents, so many accounts in our interviews that mention neighborhood Japanese mothers who were just selflessly helping Zainichi families for no reason, but their understanding of Japanese Korean devastation under Japanese imperial rule. They basically witnessed that day to day. I want to introduce this very shocking account about by the parents of the murder victim in Komatsukawa incident. The Komatsukawa incident was an incident in which a Korean teenager man allegedly murdered 2 Japanese schoolgirls, and he was sentenced to death. And he became a movie by Oshima Nagisa, and it actually became a very huge issue in Japanese society. But anyway, the parents of one of the murder victims said that they opposed strongly to the death sentence of this boy because they remember vividly how bloody the river became after the massacre of Koreans in the aftermath of the Korean Kanto earthquake. So they felt deeply about the Japanese imperial problems and sins, and Zainichi Korean issues are Japanese responsibility. So this came from the parents of the murder victim, which is incredible, I think. And I also wrote about Japanese wives who married Korean activists in the 1950s and 60s. 2 examples I put here are Yamazaki Tomoko and Sumi Keiko. And they were also explicitly saying that by devoting themselves to nation building of North Korea or Zainichi society, they wanted to free themselves from imperial guilt. And there were also a number of Japanese civic groups against the detention center, school discrimination, and so on. So what I want to say here is that there was no organized school of thought about deimperialization, but Zainichi society could be a window through which that we can study ordinary Japanese people's effort to sort of deal with imperial guilt. But at the same time, I also want to say that around the 1960s onward, there was a widening gap between these Japanese people, Japanese activists, and Chonryun. As I said, Chonryun retreated from Japanese political scenes. So in the 1960s, when the Japanese society was hot in contentious politics, Chonryun was not there. So there was no real collaboration between Zainichi, so Japanese advocates for Zainichi people like Suzuki Michihiko, who was a French literature scholar, and also the New Left during the student demonstrations. So there's no, Zainichi issues were a little not underrepresented in the 1960s in Japanese politics because Chonryun was not there. Okay, finally, my third point is to see Zainichi society as a porous borderland. So as I said, Chonryun and Mindan had bloody conflicts, and they really, they didn't like each other. And many people think this was a mirror of what's happening in the Korean Peninsula, but I think it was more than that. I think this affiliation of Chonryun to North Korea, Mindan to South Korea, created a lot of information crossings happening through Zainichi family networks. So within each Zainichi family, someone has connections with Chonryun and someone else with Mindan. So through this, unofficial routes, there was a lot of communication across the DMZ. And that's not limited to just Zainichi families, but it included Japanese people as well. I put Morisaki Kazue's book cover over here. Morisaki Kazue was second generation colonist who grew up in colonial Korea. She visited her old classmates in South Korea in the early 1970s. And her Korean friends asked her to find to contact the Cheonryong basically to get in touch with their own family members who were stuck in North Korea. So through these personal connections, the information traveled very easily. But that also created security concerns. So frequent crossings heightened security concerns of the North and South Korean governments. They had high concerns, strong concerns about espionage. And they were not paranoid. They were actually really, they existed real threats as well. So there are a number of incidents such as kidnapping of Kim Dae-jun, which happened through Zainichi people and in Japan, and also an assassination of Park Chung-hee's wife in 1974. So these incidents indicate that Zainichi society was a big security concern for both governments. So Zainichi society was a massive borderland where communication and threats existed all at the same time. Okay, to conclude, sorry for going through this so fast, but I'm happy to answer any questions later. So Cheonryong was not just homeland oriented, it represented Korean decolonization. Zainichi politics impacted Japanese society in Korean homelands as well. Zainichi's histories deserve a lens that goes beyond an ethnic minority angle, and decolonization and deimperialization that I mentioned briefly today are two of many major historical themes. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sayaka, for a really crisp and clear and fascinating presentation, which really, I think, for me, and I think for many people who take a sort of present-oriented view of the past and who come to know of the close connections between the Zainichi community and the North Korean organization, are puzzled because of their understanding of present-day North Korea and as not a welcoming and open place. So I think your talk and your work, ongoing work, is really valuable to bring to light that the reasons behind that, as well as the bit on the meaning of the Zainichi experience for Japanese activists. That was really fresh and helpful. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. I've got one of my own, but I want to turn to the audience to start. First from Catherine Starr, who's a fellow in the program on U.S.-Japan relations, and most recently, before that, a journalist with NHK World. And so I'm going to ventriloquize the questions today because of our webinar format. So I'll, in Katie's voice, my question is about your point that the U.S., through its occupation forces, inherited ideas about Zainichi and Korea from Japan. How has that played out in the ensuing decades? And has that inheritance shaped current modern U.S.-Japan-Korean relations or held them back from true diplomatic equality?
Okay, that's an interesting answer. Interesting question. Thank you. Well, the occupation itself really shaped the course the Japanese government took against Korea and also against Zainichi Koreans. And then Americans didn't think too much of it, to be honest. So when they left, I don't think they thought about the consequence that they created in the Japanese politics or Zainichi Korean situations. And when it comes to the impact on the U.S.-Japan-Korean relations, I think there was a strong emphasis on appreciating Japan over Korea, South Korea for a long time, but I'm not an expert on this. But I can see a lot of racism that overlapped between Japan's racism against Koreans and US policymakers or intellectuals who might have idea of white supremacy as we still see in academia. So I don't have a clear answer to this, but I think it's worth studying further about how Japan became the source of knowledge base for American East Asian policies. But I think it's understudied.
Thank you. Yes, I certainly agree with that. The next question is from a graduate student here at Harvard, although she's right now in Japan, Sarah Khan. Thank you, Professor Chatani, for this wonderful presentation. I have a question about how decolonization worked on the ground, literally, in terms of post-war land reform. Could you speak a bit more about how these bottom-up efforts in Korea and Japan, which you call grassroots territoriality, worked against or with top-down retributive reforms by the US military?
Okay. So many Koreans occupied illegally the places where they were basically slums, underclass slums. They occupied places where Japanese people did not want to live. They sometimes created residences above the river, as I showed in the photo, or on the river banks, or near garbage shelter, like garbage collection shelters, or prisoners detention center. So they really occupied forcefully, and they created somewhat illegally occupied areas. So it really depends on the region as well. And they defended, so basically many of Koreans were engaged in black market sales, and they created illicit liquor as well. So tax collectors and police tended to inspect these slums very frequently. And that confrontation between Korean residents and Japanese tax collectors created a sense of sort of territorial sort of autonomy. They had this borderline between this is our world and you don't step in here. I don't know if I answered my question, but I really elaborated on this in my JAS articles. I hope you will take a look later.
Thanks. The questions are pouring in. There's already 10. Well, you've answered 2. So I'm gonna, but I want to jump in with a quick question of my own. One of the things that is notable if you compare the histories of the North Korean and South Korean societies and economies is that until the mid-1970s, at least in economic terms, the North Korean economy is, as it's measured in GDP per capita, is about the same as the Southern economy, as you know, of course. And also in terms of democracy, until around then and later, South Korea is hardly a shining light of democracy. I've tended to point to those 2 factors in explanations as to the allegiance of so many Zainichi community members in the 50s and 60s to Chongryon. Is that, in your interviews, does that ever come up, or is it, your focus is more on a different kind of internal identity dynamics, and it's very compelling. Can you say something about whether the things I've just mentioned are part of that thinking as you've done?
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand that South Korea was not better than North Korean society in the 1950s and 60s. And there was a sort of a hope, the socialist development that they embraced among Zainichi people, Chonryun believers, for sure. But that doesn't mean that they vetted for North Korea because they were rich, right? It's not about material benefit, but it was about a pride in nation building, socialist nation building that's happening in North Korea. So yes and no. And also another major element in their loyalty is the fact that North Korean government Kim Il-sung sent educational aids to Korean schools in Japan when Syngman Rhee was totally rejecting to consider Zainichi as any part of his nation building. So obviously, from Zainichi point of view, it was only Kim Il-sung who cared about them.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Got a question here from Guy Pennington. I'm curious about the Japanese supporters of Zainichi activism. Were they mostly the members of the Japan Communist Party, or were there also those who were not necessarily aligned with leftist groups in Japan?
I think they were mostly leftist if they were not JCP members. They worked really closely together up until 1955. And in the official Chonryun discourse, that was a mistake. But even after that, so basically without Chonryun, there were lots of left-leaning intellectuals who might be against JCP's ways of thinking, so politics, so policies. They try to help Zainichi Koreans outside of Chonryun. So yes, there were many people outside of JCP, but JCP was also a strong supporter of the leftist Zainichi for a long time.
Great, thanks a lot. So from Hannah Shepard, who you know, thank you, Sayaka, for such a fascinating talk. I would love to hear more about the most pertinent parallels or comparisons you see internationally to the Zainichi Chonryun decolonization movement of the 50s and 60s.
Comparisons. It's very difficult to say that because there are many contrasts that I can see. For example, my friend, and colleague, Chen Wen-kun, whose book is coming out soon. Anyway, he works on the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines, and this Chinese diaspora group was KMT affiliated. So they created loyalty to Taiwan. They created lots of ethnic schools and so cultural activities and lots of interactions going back and forth between Philippines and Taiwan as well. So that's kind of similar as well. KMT's engagement with Chinese diaspora was quite similar to North Korean engagement with Zainichi Chonryun people. Another example is Indonesian Chinese populations who went back to China. So just like there are only two examples in the world where people migrated from the capitalist camp to socialist camp. One was the Chonryun, the other one is the Chinese Indonesians. So there are parallels in bringing back the capitalist ideas and cultural consumer cultures back to the socialist societies. So there are bits and pieces that I can identify as similar. I don't know if I answered your question very well.
There's so many questions, and I'm scrolling through sort of them to pick up some that maybe continue some of the threads of the discussion this far. So I'm sorry for those who might be skipping over in the audience. Alan Dye asked a question that's a bit related to Hannah's. I was fascinated by your mention of the Cultural Revolution that took place within Chonryun society during the 1960s. You mentioned that this was influenced in large part by the personality cult of Kim Il-sung, but you mentioned a bit earlier in your talk that Chonryun was also drawing from international decolonization and third world movements. I know that during the 60s and the 70s, many third world movements drew inspiration from the PRC and the perceived success of the Cultural Revolution in China. So were Zainichi Koreans and Chonryun society influenced by perceptions of those events in China as well? Did that come up in your interviews?
They're definitely, well, there were definitely parallels, but North Korean bubble was quite strong that I don't think they thought they were following the Chinese way of Cultural Revolution. They didn't call it Cultural Revolution. They didn't know what was happening, but they were kind of in this moment of politicization, very harsh idealization, I don't know what the term is, ideological mobilization in the late 1960s, which makes a total parallel with what was happening in North Korea. So the personality cult of Kim Il-sung started earlier, but really accelerated around the same time in the late 1960s. And if you think of what was happening in Zainichi politics, it makes sense because in the 1960s, as I said, Mindan became much stronger in the mid 1960s. So around this time, there was a sort of identity crisis or very strongly felt security crisis among Chonyeon people. So it really made sense to devote themselves to even higher standard of ideological devotion. So until that Cultural Revolution period ended by ousting the leader who instigated that, they didn't realize what was happening. So in retrospect, we can call it the Cultural Revolution, but they didn't know. I don't think they had the name for it.
Thank you. By the way, I should say to all those of you who posted questions, we will pass on all the questions to Sayaka after the talk. We only have about 10 minutes. We're not going to be able to, I believe, get to all of them. But David Ambers has a question that is also of interest to me, so I'm going to jump to it. While Chongyun withdrew from Japanese politics, did Zainichi Korean workers and activists also withdraw from the Japanese labor movement? Conversely, did the Japanese labor movement attend to concerns of Zainichi Korean workers?
It's my working hypothesis. And my working hypothesis is yes, they retreated from the labor movement. And I really tried, well, maybe not hard enough because of the corona, but I kind of spooky tried to get a sense of what Chonyeon was doing in the major labor movements in, for example, Mitsui Mitsuike, Tanko, or sort of kogai pollution sites like Yokkaichi. But there's like, no, there's nothing really happening. So, which is really weird because they're in these factory heavy regions. Of course, there are many Zainichi Koreans, and of course, there were a big Chonyeon representation there, but they didn't really get involved in the labor movements or anti-pollution movements. So my feeling is that, yes, but it's just a working hypothesis.
Yeah, that's so interesting because as you say, and I've been learning this in some of my own work now on sort of history and sites of the World Heritage sites, many Korean laborers, including the drafted Korean workers brought over during the war, were in these mines and stayed in these. Those who stayed were still in those communities after the war. And in relation to that, I want to circle back to a question a little earlier up on, if you're scrolling also, Sayaka from Oliver Moxham. Thank you for your talk. Through my own research of historical narratives around the Asia-Pacific War, I'm curious what discussions there are within Zainichi communities among their unwilling role as a labor force and conscripted military force of the Japanese Empire. When considering imperial guilt and the porous nature of Zainichi identity, are you aware of any discourse around this?
Discourse around the issue of forced laborers?
Forced labor, I believe,
during wartime?
End of the question, yeah.
I think both organizations have investigation committees, especially I only know of Chonyeon, but it actually is more related to the regional identities. So Chonyeon is a big central organization, but it's really, it relied on grassroots support. So the regional differences are very strong. And places like Hokkaido, they have a strong identity about Kyosei Rodo, so the forced labor issue. So they do investigate, they dig up the bones, and they do workshops about that, and they have a very active program to sort of deal with the memory of forced laborers. But from Hokkaido's point of view, I think Tokyo Central Organization is a little too cold about this initiative. So there are regional differences, and of course Hiroshima has, you know, atomic bomb victims, and that became a bigger issue more recently after this Cultural Revolution era. But anyway, so at the regional level, there are lots of investigations, and at the central level too, the Chonron has many committees to investigate more histories about forced laborers. I think Mindan also has some movements or a committee study group about them, but I'm not aware too much about their activities. And this discourse-wise, I'm not sure what you were imagining, if they have different, more complicated historical discourse, but I think their first impetus is to let people know about the fact of forced laborers.
Yeah, I've been doing some reading on this history, and a good number of the investigative works that I run across published in Japanese are by members of the Zainichi community. It's not always clear to me where their affiliations might lie, but that's my impression too.
Yeah, there are many.
What happened? We want to go on. We want to excavate the record and make it part of public awareness as to what happened. It seems to be a powerful impulse. Maybe there's time for one more question. I'm going to turn to Hiroma Nagahara's question. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I was really struck by your description of Zainichi community as a porous borderland. I realize that the Korean War took place before the formal establishment of Chonryong, but was there any sense during that war that in some sense, Japan itself was a virtual front from the perspective of US, Japan, or the competing Korean forces?
Yes, absolutely. So Dokyo Che has an interesting article about how Zainichi people got involved in the Korean War. And Chonryong was, back then it's called Minjeon. Minjeon's side really attacked the Japanese production of weapons to serve the American goals, right? American military operations. And Mindan side, they basically found volunteers to go to South Korea to fight together with South Koreans. So both sides did get involved in the Korean War in different ways. But yes, especially for the Minjeon people, the front line of their battles was in Japan. That's definitely.
Right. Okay, well, there's one very quick factual question, so I'll turn to it. We've got a couple of minutes left. From Ed Baker. Was the top leadership of Chosoren originally from the north or south in Korea? If you can generalize.
Interesting question. Some of them are refugees from South Korea. So they used to be members of the Labour's Party in South Korea, and they basically became a political refugee, and they migrated to Japan, and they became the Chonryong cadres and top leaders. That's possible. Some of top cadres also allegedly came from North Korea, but I'm not familiar with the names. But they were not necessarily the top leader. The top leader for a long time, called Handosu, he was a Zainichi person who originally came to Japan during the colonial period from South Korea.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a terrific presentation, and best evidence for that is how many people have posted questions. Quite remarkably, I think it's about a fifth of our audience has sent in a question. There's 20 or there's 19 questions. So we will pass them on, and if you would like, you can write back to people later, but that as you like. But we're at the appointed time to end, so I want once again to thank Sayaka Chatani for a fantastic presentation, and I'm looking forward to seeing this work appearing in the future.
Thank you very much.